Sharkey, what's your favorite thing about mortuary law? We're talking the law today. Give us your favorite thing about mortuary law.
My single favorite part of mortuary law is when I get calls from funeral directors who are often in a panic, as they are, understandably
We are one
so.
to do.
Yeah, as they are wont to do, myself, included back in the day. I didn't have me to call back then. My favorite thing is troubleshooting, triage, basically troubleshooting a problem for a funeral director when they are in the midst of it. To me, there's nothing more satisfying in the realm of mortuary law than when I'm on the phone and it's like, hey, Attorney Sharkey, the family's in the next room and they're screaming at each other about X. What do I do? Or, hey, Shark, I'm at the graveside and the body just fell off the lowering device. What do I do? But, stuff like that where I am in the moment with that funeral director.
Yeah.
That to me is the most satisfying thing.
Yeah, you probably have had so many stories. For our listeners, I'm sure you could already pick up on Sharkey, as he's one to be known, is in mortuary law. He helps with a bunch of funeral homes throughout the country, a bunch of associations. I could let you go down your whole history and line of work that you do,
Sure.
but he's very involved in the funeral service and funeral directors. Got a ton of fun stories. So Sharkey, I like let's start off with a bang. Like give me one of those crazy stories that we all want to hear, like in funeral service.
Like the cocktail party story at the funeral
Yeah,
director convention story.
exactly.
Yeah,
Let's hear
which is
that.
a very high bar,
It
right?
sure is. We got plenty of stories to go around.
If you're at a convention, a funeral directors convention, with, by the way, funeral directors, for those of you that don't know, for those of you that are civilians, you get a group of funeral directors together and they can make Minot, North Dakota look like the Las Vegas Strip, okay? And
It's
the
so
reason
true.
is because as funeral directors, right, wrong, or otherwise, we are expected to be very reserved, especially if you're in a small town, right?
Yeah,
Because the
yeah,
pastor's always watching you.
yeah.
And when you get them out of that environment, they can let loose. So they're
Yes.
so much fun. Um, Probably want to just of the stories I can share, because litigation is not yet concluded.
Of course.
Of the stories I can share, uh, I get a call not all that long ago, and it was, "Hey Shark, I just had the medical examiner drop off a brain in an ice cream bucket, a pail."
No
And
kidding.
we'd already cremated the individual, and uh, the medical examiner dropped the ball
Drop
and
the
did not
bucket.
include, yeah, it dropped the ball and did not include that organ in the and it was normally in the viscera bag. And what do
What?
I do? And I'm like, I get a lot of weird calls, but that's a new one.
So
And I
what?
won't tell you how I solved it because that's how I make my living.
Right.
But
No, but what? So what
yeah,
happened? Like, what was the reasoning? Like, how did they possibly forget that during the operation?
the medical examiners, I think it was technically a coroner.
Okay.
Um, I think technically,
Yeah.
and there is a difference. I think they dropped the ball, and I can only imagine that they're back at the medical examiner suite, and they're like, "Hey, where'd this come from?"
Holy crap.
I mean, honestly, it's not. It's funny. It's also very disturbing.
Yeah.
But and then to deliver the organ in an ice cream pail is just the OSHA flags just are off the roof. Not
Yeah.
okay.
No.
But the individual had already been cremated, so it
Right.
isn't like we couldn't. Normally, of course, for everybody to know, normally all the organs that are removed during an autopsy are included in what we call a viscera bag, and that viscera bag is cremated with the rest of the human remains.
It's
In
everyone's
this
favorite
case,
bag to open up. It's like Christmas morning opening that bag.
um, but that was one that even for me, I was like, okay, there is no manual on this.
No.
I did have, and this is not a completely, this is
Crazy
not
though.
wholly unheard of. And there's probably some older funeral directors out there that are like, oh, I remember back in the day. I got a call from a person who had just bought a funeral home, and they went down in the basement of the funeral home, And they discovered, way back in the whatever part of this old part of the basement, they discovered a series of anywhere from, yay long to almost 3 foot long, yay wide, yay tall
Yeah.
hunks of concrete that had been poured, and they were labeled, like scrawled in,
Okay.
Mr. Smith's leg, 1940 whatever. And what it was is it was a farming community, and apparently they weren't very good with safety devices in that community, and there were amputations.
What?
And these individuals had wanted to have their amputated, which by the way, in all seriousness, for some people is a very important religious tenet.
Sure.
But these folks wanted to be able to have their limbs, buried with them. And this was how that particular funeral director back in, pre-war, had decided to preserve them. And of course, it just never happened, right? And so, and they're like, "What do we do?" And I was like, "Leave them for the next guy, man." I mean,
Yeah, I'm not touching
but yeah,
that.
that was, and I know that I have heard anecdotally that is, other places have done that, but that's just one of the many weird things.
Absolutely absurd.
We as funeral directors, we don't have to make. There's no fiction for funeral directors, because our reality can be so strange, and I don't mean that in a negative way, and I don't mean it in a crass way ever. It's just that we live this wonderful but yet strange life and profession that brings with it so many of these strange little things that we can only tell so many people.
Right, and that's what brings us together too, is that we could share those stories like you're saying, because you're not going to tell that to any Joe Schmo on the street, and that's
No.
another reason why those conventions are probably crazy, because you can unleash and like tell all your stories that people you can tell it to.
And there's a catharsis to know that you're not the only one experiencing this.
Yep,
You're not.
absolutely.
There are other people are going through the same thing that you are as a funeral director. And by the way, when I say funeral director, I mean funeral director and embalmer.
Yes,
I mean,
of course, of course.
there are states in which they're different
The
things.
separation.
I hold licenses. I hold a mortician's license and I hold a funeral director's license in 2 different states, but they're combos, right? So I can embalm or meet with families. So when I say funeral director, I mean overall, the over-encompassing term.
So you started off as a funeral director. What made you get into funeral, like, anything mortuary to begin with? And then you took a nice right hard turn into law, but still staying in funeral service. So you have an interesting dynamic.
I grew up in the greenhouse and floral business, and in a small town. And for me, there was absolutely nothing strange about the local funeral directors. They were business people, just like my parents, and my parents had business relationships with them.
Right.
And I was going in funeral homes since I was old enough to hold the door for my dad to get a casket spray in, or to hold a bud vase in my little lap so it didn't tip over. And to see the funeral directors, they're always dressed nice. And I grew up in a small town in the middle of nowhere, and people didn't have suits, but unless it was a wedding or a funeral, you didn't wear a suit. And these guys wore suits all the time, and that was cool. They're always reserved. They were always classy. They had a cool car. And so, but there was nothing strange about them. We're just business people. And my mom being the local florist, if she had to work on all day Sunday, because there was a funeral on Monday, she worked all day Sunday. If she had to work on Christmas or Thanksgiving, she had to work on that time. And so it just wasn't weird. And I was out of college. I had a biology degree, and I had just graduated from college. And, like 2 days later, I was helping my parents, and I delivered funeral flowers, and I always kind of wanted to be I always was interested in it.
Sure.
I had worked in the anatomy department in college as a diener. It's an old school word for somebody who helps with cadavers.
Got it.
And it's from the German diener. But and so the local funeral director is like, "You ever think about funeral directing?" And I was like, "Yeah, I have actually." Yeah. He's like, "You want to be my apprentice?" And I said, "Okay." I had a job lined up, but it didn't start for months. and he's
No
offering me a
kidding.
job like tomorrow. He's like, you start tomorrow morning. I'm like, okay. So
Wow.
took off. Yeah. I ran down that day. I ran down to, it was a 60-mile drive, but I ran to a place where I could buy, when my mom came with, and bought a couple of suits and a sport coat or two and some new shoes, and showed up next day. You're now an apprentice.
Official
So
mortician.
or at least an apprentice. Back in those days, we actually had to sign indentureship papers.
What does that mean?
It was actually a way of protecting, like you've heard indentured servant.
Yeah.
It's not that exactly, but it's that you agree that you're the apprentice, this is the master.
Oh.
And it also set out, it was actually a way to protect the apprentice. And we've all heard the horror stories.
Sure.
Of how poorly apprentices or interns are treated.
Yeah.
And by the way, that is still that way in some parts of the country, and it is not at all that way in other parts, which I'd be happy to talk about, because there's a huge difference in pay for funeral directors. And when you see a huge difference in pay for funeral directors, you also see a huge difference in how they're treated. But anyway, back in the day that I had to be paid minimum wage, I couldn't, I had to be paid time and a half after 40 hours. And it was just a way of protect. But it's just kind of funny that we had indentureship papers back then.
Yeah,
so I got into funeral directing, and then I went to mortuary school at the University of Minnesota Mortuary Science program. I already had a biology degree. Took off from there.
Cool. Well, what was the beginning of your career like, or your years as a funeral director? What did you like to do? Were you front of the house, behind the snes?
I did this in my own small hometown.
Okay.
Where if I didn't know who you were, or know your cousin, or at least knew of you, that was, the exception to the rule. I either knew or knew of anybody that I was in, any family I was meeting, and anybody who's, who was brought into my care, anybody I was embalming. So I got this, it was literally burying, because, we had a very low cremation rate back then in that particular place. If I didn't know you, that was weird. And so it was very much my friends and even a few family members, that I had this experience with. And then I went from there I moved to the big city, and I worked at a place at what the time was the largest funeral home in the state, and they were doing about 2,200 calls a year or so.
Holy crap.
And I didn't know anybody, and you just got handed off, boom, boom, boom. Yeah. I put myself through law school, living and working in a funeral home. So
that's sweet. So why law? So you were in funeral service. You clearly like funeral service. So what made you switch and move into the law then after a while?
A girl. Right? Like that's how many stories start like that.
As we all.
A girl. Yeah. So as any epic poem may begin, there was a girl. What had happened was I met somebody in mortuary school,
of course.
And so, it was a funeral director for a while, and I had always been interested in law school. And she's like, "You're done with this. You're going to law school." And I was like, "Yes, dear." So I went to law school. She's not around anymore. But my law degree
Rest in
is.
Peace.
She's great, but
I'm kidding.
But my law degree is still there, and so that's how I ended up, and then I ended up living and working in a funeral home.
Nice. And then you transitioned from there into becoming so how did it work?
And mortuary law was not. I will tell you what happened with that is I went to work at a litigation firm. It would fit my personality to be a litigator, to be, a trial attorney. Yeah. That fit my personality, and it fit how I think and on my feet and be quick.
Sure.
And I don't have the patience to do transactional work. Also, I find it boring.
Yeah.
So I was a litigator, and I got my first. I had somebody that had been a classmate of mine called me up, and they had run into some trouble. On a licensing issue. So it's administrative law. And they wanted me to represent them. I agreed. And my boss, one of the partners at the firm, I was like, "Hey, I got my first mortuary law case." And he's like, "What? That's not a thing." And I'm like, "No, yeah, it is." And he's like, "No, you're making this up." And so the very first law firm I was at, I tried to develop this mortuary law practice. Yeah. And they're like, "You're just making this up. There is no such thing." And now,
Super
18
important.
years later, I'm like, 100% of my practice is mortuary law.
Yeah.
That's all I do. So it was a progression. A few years, I opened my own law firm, Sharkey Law. Find me at mortuarylaw.com. And after being at a couple firms and kind of moving the needle from litigator to mortuary law, going from 25%, 75, 50, and now it's only mortuary law anymore. I still do litigation, but only on behalf of funeral homes or families or cemeteries or crematories. So yes, I still do litigation, but it's always couched within the context of
Mortuary law.
Death care.
Got it. That's super interesting, and such a fine niche you find yourself in, because you have the experience, so you can relate to all these funeral homes and all the cemeteries and everything else, and then you actually have the law side where you can help and be a part of the best practices too.
The number of attorneys that speak funeral I can count on one hand.
Very little, I'm sure. It's a huge thing.
I,
It's the same thing for what we do. Like, there are very few marketers that come from funeral service. It doesn't add up. So it's like, when you have that connection, that experience, you can speak funeral to people, and they get it. We understand each other.
I've developed this kind of, and it's a joke, and obviously, but I've had a couple of people say, "Well, I'll never use you. I have my own attorney."
Yeah.
I'm like, well, first of all, I don't care. First of all, let's be clear, I don't care. But my joke has become, oh, you have an attorney? Yeah, I have an attorney. Oh yeah. If we get in trouble, you take care of it. Oh, first of all, great.
Yeah.
Again, I don't care. Like, fine.
Yeah.
But I say, call him up right now and say, put me on the clock. In 10 seconds, tell me the difference between a cannula and a casket. He's like, well, you wouldn't have a clue about that. And I'm like, and yet that's your attorney.
Right. Because you don't know what you're going to get yourself into. Like, I'm sure you've seen so many crazy, unbelievable variants in your cases. That's got to keep your job pretty interesting too.
I wake up every day happy to practice law, happy to have the wonderful, wonderful clients that I have, whether they be cemeterians, people who run crematories, or the majority, my funeral director peeps, my beloved colleagues in this dismal trade of ours. Having the chance to, funeral director, we always talk about, it's a privilege to serve, right? And that's one of the things. Talk to any funeral director, you will eventually hear her say, it's a privilege to serve. That's how I feel. I don't serve families directly. I serve funeral directors. Yeah. And that to me is just, it's a reason to get up in the morning, and it puts a smile on my face at the end of the day, that I'm there for them and I can help them, navigate the pitfalls of, being a funeral director in 2024. And Navigating the Minefield was a book about the pitfalls, the legal pitfalls of funeral service a while back, and it's true. You are in a minefield, as you know.
Right. You never know what you're going to get your hands on, and people are seeking, especially if maybe it's a frustrated family or friend or whoever it is. They're looking for someone to blame if they had a difficult loss, or maybe they weren't happy about the relationship at the end, whatever it might be. People often take their anger out at us. So you got to be careful, because they're going to find any reason they're going to get at you. They're going to get at your funeral home, your business, and then you're going to be in trouble. And it's a scary, scary thing.
I will tell you this, Mr. Cooney, take this to the bank.
Okay.
If it weren't for funeral directors, nobody would ever die.
Let me think about that for a second.
If it weren't for funeral directors, nobody would ever die. In other words,
what do you mean?
People come. If it weren't for funeral directors, nobody would ever die. The concept that I'm really angry, and maybe I have a lot of unresolved grief issues, and being a funeral director, how grief can affect the way a person acts and reacts. Right. That they automatically take it out on the funeral director. Wasn't for you, my dad wouldn't have died. You're the funeral director, so I'm automatically angry at you because of what you. And of course, I say that to be absurd. Yeah, because it is absurd.
It is.
And yet, And
It
yet,
happens.
when I say that to a lot of funeral directors, they're like, "Yeah, sure." And I feel like that some days. That people
Yeah.
blame me because if we didn't have funeral directors, we wouldn't have death.
Right. They blame you
You know,
for the
in the
situation.
public's mind, in a lot of ways. How weird that is.
Yeah, that it's messed up, and it's not. It's not a good thing. It isn't at all. Let's skip.
No, and of course, you know, as you know, a lot of times I'm on the phone with a client, and I'm like, look, this family, and they're questioning themselves, which is always good to question yourself. You know, check yourself.
Of
Like,
course.
look, this person or this whole family is having an adverse grief reaction, and they're taking it out on you.
Yeah.
Do not question your professionalism. Do not question your ethical standards. You're doing the right thing. They're making you second guess yourself. You know, you're having a little bit of imposter syndrome,
Yeah.
which is good because the way this family is negatively acting towards you. But don't let
Yeah.
that get you down.
It's literally spot on. I was on another podcast yesterday, and we were talking about the very similar, very so close, and literally talked about imposter syndrome, like in that same aspect of thinking. And you just have to stick to your guns and know that you're doing the right thing. And people are going to make you feel bad. They're going to say mean things. They're going to be harsh to you. They're going to ask for a million things, and you're not going to ever be able to fully deliver. But in your heart, when you know that you're serving and doing the best, that's all you can do.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's skip
You know,
back a little bit. Let's skip back a little bit and
sure.
talk about the apprentice difference throughout the country. You briefly touched on it, and I'm very intrigued, and I want to hear about that.
So I was gonna say I get around. I don't mean it like that.
Sure,
But
sure.
I get around. You know, I did last year in 2023. I think I did 20 different speaking gigs, and they're at, you know, mostly state conventions. So I get
Sure.
around quite a bit, all the way. You know, last year I went all the way from New Hampshire to California and
Nice.
many places in between. And then I'm also involved in a Facebook page called Prep Room, which is a closed group just for funeral directors.
Uh-huh.
I'm also involved as an admin and help run an open Facebook page for civilians called Ask the Embalmer / Funeral Professional. It's a place,
Oh,
and we can talk about those in a little bit.
yeah.
But so I think I have a pretty good finger on the pulse of what people are experiencing
Sure.
as far as wages and you know,
Treatment.
basically
Hmm.
how much respect is given to the profession in any given place.
Yeah.
And there's a very big difference in wages regionally.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that, and when you, well, I don't think, I know, when you have states like, for example, Minnesota is a good example. When you have a state like Minnesota, we are begging for people for, you know, to come be funeral directors here.
Yeah.
And nobody gets mistreated in Minnesota. Okay, I'm going to say that. You don't get treated. You know why?
It's the Midwest.
Because there are 10 funeral homes that will hire you that, and I mean that fast.
Yeah.
If you're like, my boss mistreated me, they're like, then you start here tomorrow. There are places further south
Okay.
that, you know, they're like, I don't care if you work here, if you go work at the Chick-fil-A.
Yeah.
In fact, you're gonna make more money at the Chick-fil-A or whatever at the
Right.
Speedy Cookie Mart,
Yeah.
and you're just chewed up and you're spit out. And it really kind of bothers me. I'm like, hey
It does.
guys,
Me too.
come on up north. And I don't mean just Minnesota, the Dakotas.
Yeah.
God, they're hiring Wisconsin, Illinois.
Yeah. Illinois for
We're all
sure, too.
Michigan. We're all begging for people up here, and we're paying for that, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So when you're being mistreated down in, you know, Pig's Knuckle wherever,
Uh-huh.
and being paid $12.50 an hour, you're going to get paid $40 an hour up, you know, maybe not 40, but you're going to get paid 30
I mean,
for first, you know, actually
yeah.
$40 an hour would not be, if you
I
actually
think-
have a license, that would
I
be
think you
very
probably would.
standard.
Yeah.
Move. Yeah, it just really, it blows me away that there are places that treat people so poorly, and yet there are places, you know, jurisdictions that we are just begging for people, and you won't be mistreated because nobody can afford to mistreat their help in certain places.
Right. And it just speaks to we have options as funeral directors. There's such a need for it. I talk about that pretty frequently. That I mean, our funeral home, for example, like we've looked for people many, many times over, and I know a ton of people in Chicagoland that are always looking, and I feel like that is standard throughout a lot of the country. So you have options, and I think to expand on maybe the mistreatment, maybe that comes from, this is just my line of thinking, that they were treated this way as an apprentice. I'm not naming names. I have a certain person in my life that is not my father, but it might be someone else in my family, that they were treated horrifically as an apprentice elsewhere. And they think that is how everyone should be because I had to do it. Or they had low wages. And it's just like trying to make back for lost time a little bit. That would be my one thing that would be like, that would make more sense to me than, I just don't understand why you're going to just go through that as a person. Just, you go find yourself another spot. There's so many places to go, so many places looking, and the ones that aren't treating their employees right, the joke's going to be on them because they're going to be out of business one day and probably not that long because no help is going to want to be there. And you need help as a funeral home owner. You need it so badly.
And I want to be clear. I mean, I'm bagging on some of the bad actors. Mostly it's good actors, okay? And, I have so many, and my clients are owners. I mean, right? Yeah. Those are my clients, are the owners and the management folk.
Yep.
And, it hurts me to see them hurting. They're like, Shark, God, I'm throwing money at people to get them to come work and I can't find anybody. Help me. And I was like, I get the call, Shark, who's looking? And I'm like, all of your competitors, and they mean, who's looking for a job? I'm like, nobody.
Yeah.
And I wish I could help, but
I know.
We've got a real, we're going to have to, as a profession, we're going to have a real we're going to have a real moment where, people need to start moving and looking at jurisdictions that are going to treat you right. And those jurisdictions where you're not treated well. And when I say jurisdictions, I mean states.
Yep.
If you have problems finding people, well, you're going to have to catch up with the rest of the country because paying a funeral director, $13-14 an hour, you might get away with that in Pig's Knuckle, wherever. But here in Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, you would get laughed at. Like you would get not even just laughed at, you probably get spat at. I mean, it's so I would love to see that change, and it's going to change. It's a market force. It's going to change.
Absolutely, it's going to. I think we're seeing
just as the idea that one of the other things is when I put on presentations is the developing. And I mean this in an extremely positive way when I use the word phenomenon. I mean that in a positive way. The developing phenomenon of women entering funeral service.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, and I have two things to say about that. Number one, this right here, I don't want to say old, but the mature white dude with a beard, in another few years, this is not the face of funeral service.
Right.
It is not.
Absolutely.
And that's great. That's positive. And there is absolutely nothing in funeral service that women can't do. And there are still some stodgy old guys that have bad attitudes, and they're really, really hurting it for everyone. If there are any females who are aspiring to be funeral directors or who are newbie funeral directors, and you feel you're feeling that whole push down patriarchy thing, believe me, there are places that would love to have you, and you will not experience that.
There's no doubt about it. Yep.
Here's another thing, and I've said this a few times, and whenever I get groans, I'll put on presentations, and I'll get cheers and groans, and when I get both at the same time, that's when I know I've really hit something.
Yeah.
Hit a spot. And that is that I am calling out that the idea that women are starting to make their mark on funeral service. And I call BS on that. Here's why. Women are not starting to make their mark in funeral service. If you look at the historical record, going all the way back to prehistoric times. We're talking about when we were burying bodies in the caves of northern Spain and southern France and covering them with ochre, putting seashells. That was all done by women.
Yeah.
Women have been undertakers. Women have been doing that work in most of our societies over thousands of years. And it is only until the Industrial Revolution that men took over funeral service, right? So I throw a BS flag on women are starting to make their mark. No, they have always been part of this. It's just that for the last 150 years or so, men have pushed them out of the way. They're back, and they should be back, and we should recognize that historical contribution, and not and like I said, this is the face of funeral service for the last 150 years. But before that and going forward, it's female, and I'm happy of it.
Yeah, that's cool. I didn't realize that. That's a fun fact. So you're saying I'm screwed having this face in funeral service in 10 years.
That's a lot for your face. I mean, just don't have this face. You'll be all right.
No, I mustn't. I think it's a beautiful thing. It's going to be very helpful for so many reasons. It's going to be helpful with families, helpful with the job force, which we both know we desperately need. I think we're seeing an influx of students. It seems like there's more and more. The capacity of these schools are increasing, and there's more students, and hopefully that turns out more funeral directors, and hopefully they stick with it, because that, I think, is one of our biggest pitfalls, is that they're quitting after 4 years, 5 years. And
I was going to say the 5-year mark.
Yeah,
man,
it's tough.
If as a funeral director, if you make it past 5 years, pretty good chance you're going to stay in the profession.
Yeah,
it's that first 5 years, and that goes back to mistreating people and paying them properly, right?
Absolutely, it does.
So,
what is your most common case that you see funeral homes? What is something that repeats all the time that you're seeing?
Number one biggest thing. So for the different associations for whom I'm general counsel, and I'm general counsel for 4 different state associations.
Nice.
For those different state associations, we all have like a helpline or that's my term for it.
Sure.
Where you, as a member benefit, you can call me and I help you understand what's going on, troubleshoot the problem. Across all those states, the number one most common issue is families fighting over the right to control the final disposition.
Oh, okay.
Absolute number one. In fact, probably 75% of the phone calls I get, which are like, I need help right now, phone calls through associations, are families in the next room, and they're fighting over. And it's usually, one of just 2 or 3 different situations. And you've experienced this, and any funeral director that has been doing this for more than about 2 minutes has experienced it. And it's couple different things. It's either one, I've been at my mom's bedside for the last 6 months.
Yeah.
And my sister that out in California, sorry, California, but she hasn't talked to my mom, so I should be in charge and she shouldn't have any say.
Yeah.
And of course we know that's not how the law works, right? She has an equal say. Or mom loved me more, therefore I'm in charge.
Ooh, tough one.
That one. Or I'm going to pay for the funeral, so I make all the decisions. The rest of you shut up.
The most common.
And there are places in which funeral directors actually believe that's the law. Whoever pays the bill, they make the law. I'm like, hey, how it works. I'll be happy to take the plaintiff's case on that, because you're gonna lose. But usually it's an argument over my sister, my brother, whoever it is, hasn't been involved, and so therefore they shouldn't have any say. And that's simply not how the law works. And all 50 states have statutory regulations as to who has the right to control the final disposition.
Right. And you just have to abide by them. And then if you don't,
you have to abide by those. And you know what? In all 50 states, they haven't been updated since, whenever. And yet modern family dynamics are such that they haven't kept up, right? And I'm not saying that they necessarily need to be tweaked, but I have my dad's on his third marriage, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I hate my stepmom, and yet she's in charge because she's married.
Right.
That's a common one. I
Yep.
should be in charge because I'm his child, and my stepmom is up.
Yeah.
Well, she's married to him.
Yeah.
She's in charge. That's
What
how the law
about
works. So,
what about one you see this relatively frequently? I'd say separated. So you have maybe it was the second husband or wife or first one. It doesn't really matter. But they're separated, but they're still technically married, and there are elder kids involved. What happens there?
okay, so I can't answer that question because there are 50 different answers. Each
Let's go through
state
them.
which is good for me as an attorney, right? Each state
True.
has a different answer to that.
Okay.
So, for example, and we got the Mississippi, we got the headwaters of the Mississippi River, and we've got Minnesota and Wisconsin, right? Here's
Yep.
Minnesota and Wisconsin, right? So, if you are in Minnesota and husband and wife are they're in the midst of a divorce, okay? And it's a nasty divorce. In fact, husband was involved with the babysitter,
Yuck.
like make it as nasty as you want, right?
Sure.
Was involved with the babysitter and then died, and
During
the
it.
wife is. I'm not going to say it, but right, make it as nasty as you want. They're in the middle of a divorce and husband dies. Under Minnesota law 149A.80 sub D2, the wife is absolutely in charge. And if she wants to say, I want that SOB cremated, and I'm going to throw his cremated remains in the garbage can.
Yeah.
And by the way, yeah, that happens. I've seen it happen.
No doubt.
That's how it works. Now, cross over the Mississippi River, a few hundred yards, and you're in Wisconsin.
Okay.
The moment that either party files for a dissolution of marriage, nice way of saying divorce. If you've ever had a divorce, you'd like to have something nice to say. It's not a divorce, it's a dissolution of marriage. Doesn't that sound nice? Still going to cost you. Now, in that situation, in Wisconsin, under Wisconsin statute 154.30 sub D B, sub D 3B, I believe it is, the moment that one party or the other files, they are cut off.
Wow.
Right? And it then it goes to the next person in line. So maybe an adult child or maybe the parents, depends on who's there. So each state has a different answer to that question. And you got to know the law in your own state. I'm always amazed at, funeral directors, they think that their state law is the only law, that it's a model law. There is not a model law out there. As far as that everybody's ever adopted. So the answer is different in each different state.
It makes it confusing, especially if you're operating
in two different.
Right. If you're on a state line, like that's got to be even more challenging to have to understand all these different dynamics and law, and it's craziness.
I have some clients that have funeral homes on either side of a state border, whatever it may be, Illinois and Wisconsin, Minnesota and South Dakota, Minnesota and Wisconsin, Washington State and Oregon, wherever it might be, Pennsylvania and Ohio, wherever it might be. And they're right on that border. I'm like, well, where's the decedent now? Where did the death take place and where's the decedent?
Right.
And I've had times where, the death has occurred in one state and the answer's this.
And they're moving.
But the body's been removed to another state, and now all of a sudden we're on a different scheme,
So that's how it works. So like, let's say that exact situation happen, and the person passed away in the situation we were just talking about. Person passes away in Minnesota, but their funeral home's in Wisconsin. What law are they following there?
Well, they have to follow. So they would follow Minnesota law, right?
Because
that's who has the right to control. Because that's where the decedent is. That's the C2 of death, right?
Right.
And so that's the law that applies. But then once that decedent comes into another jurisdiction, and by the way, there's some carve outs, but we would get into some big long. That's my That's my master's or PhD level mortuary law class.
Got it.
So, but then we get into Wisconsin, and Wisconsin law applies. So the question is well, what happens if the Wisconsin funeral, and we're only using Minnesota and Wisconsin as just easy examples, any two states. What happens to the funeral director, just goes and does the removal, and maybe they shouldn't have, because the answer to who's in charge may be different in different states, as we've shown. So,
whoa, that's a weird situation. That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
I got another question for you that I feel like funeral directors and funeral homes have all the time. What about old cremated remains? I'm sure this is state by state as well, but I'd like to hear your take on that. Like for my family in particular, we don't have the heart to go scatter them after X amount of years, which I'm pretty sure for most states that's the way you could do it, or you could bury it at a cemetery at a group. But we don't have the heart to do that. So what is your suggestion? We have cremated remains from back when my grandfather was around funeral directing. So what is your recommendation with the law with that?
So as funeral directors, we have a term for this. It's called the closet of memories.
Yes, exactly.
You've heard that.
We have two closets.
It was around long before Thomas Lynch, but Mr. Lynch, being the poet laureate of funeral service, he did bring it into our own lexicon, or maybe I should say into the popular lexicon, the closet of memories, and the idea that a funeral home has this place somewhere in the funeral home in which there are urns, old urns, often temporary urns,
boxes,
that have just been abandoned, and as you very honestly and ethically put, we just don't like the idea of I can't say every state, most states have a statutory or a regulatory scheme by which the funeral home can get those cremated remains out of the funeral home and to a permanent resting place. Mm-hmm. I am a big, and each one is different. There's notice requirements for each state.
Sure.
You have to write family. Does have to be certified. You have to send out 3 letters. You have to send out 2 letters. You have to be, 30 days in between each letter. All that stuff. It's actually very, very state specific. But in the most general sense, what you want to do is you put the family on written notice, paper the file. You show that you did this, do it certified mail so that you can prove that, they got the information. And then I do not like the idea of scattering. There are those that do. I personally do not advise it. You go and you purchase the most inexpensive mausoleum space that you can as a funeral home. And you then, in bulk, you take your closet of memories that after you have properly notified under your particular state's rules, properly notified all those families, and go and you place those cremated remains very, very carefully according to a grid so that you know where everybody is. And one of the things you always want to do, and I'm giving a freebie here, is that you always want to have the funeral home tell the family they're going to be responsible for any costs. So if you show up and you're like, hey, we got this letter 3 years ago and it said, that our mom would be placed, we want her. Okay, well, she's in a mausoleum space. You'll notice that the letter says that you're responsible for the cost. Because a mausoleum, the cemetery, isn't just going to open that up and say, here you go. They're going to expect, rightly so,
of course,
the cost of removing the plate and all that stuff. So that's how I suggest people do that. But again, don't just go do that. This is nothing I say is legal advice. Disclaimer, big asterisk disclaimer, because each and every state, is different. And you may have PR issues. You may have some business questions about, this or that or the next thing. So I mean, there are veterans organizations that are saying, hey, if you have any veterans who've been abandoned at your funeral home, just give them to us. That is a very noble, very, very noble idea. It's a very noble cause. It's also going to be illegal in many states.
Right. Yeah.
It doesn't mean you can't be done, but you have to go through the proper disclosures to the family before you do that.
For me, it seems like the amount of effort and time and risk that you're taking on doing it, for me, I was like, I'm just going to keep that closet.
Well,
let the next
here's the
guy
thing
worry
is,
about it. I don't know.
here's the thing, Mr. Cooney, is that when we talk about risk, though, you have risk having those cremated remains in your care.
That's true
Because,
as well. Someone can
they're
steal
down in the
them.
basement
Yeah.
and there's a flood. I guarantee if there's a flood at your funeral home, or I guarantee if there's a fire at your funeral home, right? It's on the news. 2 days later, you're going to have a bunch of people. Hey, we left Grandpa there 10 years ago. You got him? We saw you guys had a flood. You got him? Right? So there is actually a risk and a liability by keeping them.
Okay. Yeah, so it's a lose-lose situation for us.
It's a lose-lose. Yeah.
So we got to stay on top of our families. You got to get them on it. And make sure that
there are statutory ways in which you can incentivize and or push families to get those cremated remains back to them.
Yeah.
But that's a paid gig.
Yeah, that's a different,
for that.
different gig. All right, Sharkey, let's end with one more. I want one more story out of you. Give me something that you've been dealing with maybe recently or not too long in the past. That'd be a good last story for our funeral directors.
Okay.
What does he got going here?
What's he got? So
okay.
So this is Bench and Bar magazine, and I made the cover back in 2017 of Bench and Bar magazine.
Hey, congrats.
And it's I wrote an article called "Grave Matters:
Okay.
The Law and Practice of Disinterment, Reinterment, and Exhumation."
All right.
And
now we're talking.
I do this work myself. I've got the coolest set of shovels you've ever seen. I'm the best paid digger that you'll ever meet. Because I charge my regular attorney fee, and if you don't want to pay that, I ain't doing it. But so in some states, not all states, but in many states, if you want to do an exhumation, and there, by the way, there's a difference, and some funeral directors will argue with me on this, and I'm like, you want to start quoting statute? Because I can quote statute like a preacher can quote the Bible. There is actually a difference between a disinterment and an exhumation. I did a thing with Carrie Northey. I don't know if you,
she's the best.
Carrie the Mortician. I did a gig with her in which she's like, Shark, 2 minutes, explain the difference. But there is a difference. There's a legal difference.
Yeah.
But doing an exhumation. And so when I have to go to court, there's a lot of fun. When I have to go to court to get an order for an exhumation, I quote myself in my petition. And I'm like, Your Honor, pursuant to the seminal article on the subject, Grave Matters, and then author Michael Sharkey. So those are a lot of fun. But I actually, I have a pickup truck, and I have a bunch of very specialized equipment that I use to do these, so that they are done in an ethical, first of all, legal, but also in an ethical manner, and which so that the subject of the extraction is treated with as much dignity and respect on the exhumation as they would be treated when we're doing the original interment. And I just did one. Well, it was in December. I just did one in December. I did one in a mausoleum. I get all Tyvek'd up and did the removal, and we took the individual out. So yeah, I do that, and it's probably
that's tough.
Well, yeah, it is tough.
I've done a couple. It is not a
sometimes you go through
situation.
a lot of those. When you're done, I go through a lot of toothpaste. And the funeral directors in the group are like, oh, I know what he means.
I know exactly what you mean, and multiple showers.
Yep.
Oh.
You strip out on the front porch, and you're burning. Those are going in the burn barrel.
Yep, they're going straight into the retort, is where mine are going.
Don't put them in the retort.
I'm just kidding, but that was awesome. Love having you on, Sharkey. That was a good time. If you're ever in some trouble, you know who to call. Michael Sharkey here. Thanks for taking the time, joining us. Super fun. What a hilarious and good, informative conversation as well. I think there's a lot of people who can learn from that. Yeah,
if you're a if you're a layperson and you're interested in funeral service issues, there's a lot of there's some good. there's some good people putting out good content. There's also some real hacks out there that are not so good, and they're putting out really crass, poor content. Just because they're popular doesn't mean they're right. But if you're looking for, on Facebook, Ask the Embalmer / funeral professional. It's a place for people and we use funeral directors, vetted funeral directors, to answer questions, to dispel a lot of the questions that live folk have, to take away that mask and that veil. If you're a legit licensed funeral director, we'd love to have you as a member of Prep Room. And if you're a funeral director who ever runs afoul or needs help, or just, hey, Shark, can you tweak my GPL? Mortuarylaw.com. Call me. But thank you so much, Mr. Cooney. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and everyone in the audience today. Thanks so much.
Love it. That's the pod.